This is Decarbonize the World with Frank Deline, solving the climate crisis while increasing profits in your business. Here's Frank.
Welcome back to my conversation with Ibrahim AlHusseini, the founder of FullCycle. We've been talking about how his firm is investing in companies that tackle the climate crisis. Now, Ibrahim, how big a part will private capital ultimately play when it comes to reversing the effects of climate change?
I think it'll play the biggest part. Governments can make investments in climate tech more appealing in all the ways that we've heard about. But thankfully, climate tech in most cases can be underwritten for its success without subsidies and without carbon monetization. And we at FullCycle only look for enterprises and technologies that can stand alone without any sort of subsidies. And we do that because we've been through enough political cycles to know that you can't depend on governments long term. One administration can get behind you, another administration can change its mind, and we have no time to deal with that kind of roller coaster ride. So we only underwrite companies, and we only invest for companies we can underwrite without the economics of attached to governments. Now, thankfully, more governments are getting behind this, and more investors and big investors are getting behind this, partially because if you think about it, it's a hedge against massive global disruption. And you know what's bad for every asset class is massive global disruption, both from climate and from geopolitical instability. Because what happens when you have a world where crop yield is collapsing, the hydro cycle has changed so much that people need to move to find water, the cost of food, water, electricity shoots through the roof, oceans rise and destroy trillions of dollars worth of coastal real estate, et cetera, et cetera. Plus the health implications. Obviously, as the warmer climate happens, we have more disease-spreading insects that come into places they never were before. So healthcare costs go through the roof, mortality goes down. It's extremely disruptive future, which will affect every asset class in the world. So even if somebody doesn't, quote unquote, care about climate, they should care about their portfolio and the money that they manage on behalf of investors from all over the world, because there is no hiding from this.
Yeah, it's so true. You said in the past, quote, we have to work for the overall we, end quote, and not just for the, quote, rich progressive bubble, end quote. How tricky is it to thread that needle?
It's not tricky at all. I mean, it's just a very pragmatic approach to addressing an issue that is a global one. And so what does that mean? There are technologies out there whose economics only work for markets, rich markets like Berlin and San Francisco. Well, the world is much bigger than Berlin, San Francisco, New York, the Hamptons, Los Angeles, London, etc. We have, all of Southeast Asia, all of the continent of Africa, all of the Middle East, all of Eastern Europe, all of South America. Like, that's the world. And that's where the biggest economic growth is happening. All those people are going to join the ranks of consumerism like everyone else. And they're going to be wanting to go on flights and vacations and buy their kids toys and, eat a steak and whatever else, all the stuff that we take for granted. So we only pick technologies that are 6-continent solutions, because they have to be 6-continent solutions, because if they don't commercially reconcile themselves in places like Kinshasa and Mumbai, and only reconcile themselves in places like London and Los Angeles, then they're never going to actually solve the problem that they're designed to solve for, which is to move us away from being a civilization that is a burden to the natural world, to being yet another species that lives on the planet and lives in harmony with the natural world. Because, we're no longer a burden on it. We're just carbon neutral. We live in a completely circular economy where we don't produce waste, and all of our waste turns into the building blocks of something else, just like nature does. And we're just in harmony with the natural world. That's what we want. That's what we need to get to.
Right.
That's option number one. Option number two is to eventually make Earth uninhabitable and somehow live in glass spheres on different planets, as if that's a good idea.
That's not a good idea. Where do you project we'll see the most growth in clean energy sector?
The biggest growth, I believe, will take hold in this methodology of prioritizing molecules. Right now, 1% of atmospheric greenhouse gases are responsible for 46% of the warming. So, and nobody's talking about this except for FullCycle and a lot of scientists that have been saying that for about 20, 30 years.
Right.
Most people are getting excited about anything, that is climate or climate adjacent without prioritizing where money needs to go in the first quarter of the 21st century, second, third, fourth, etc. And this notion of investing in something we could be investing in 75 years is going to start going away. Where we are actually thinking through what needs to be replaced first. For example, let's talk about something that wasn't even part of the climate conversation a decade ago, even though we've been talking about it. Landfills.
Right.
In 2019, NASA sent a satellite over California to see where methane was leaking out of the existing natural gas infrastructure, and they found 3 leaks and fixed them. Another thing they found is that in our so-called sealed sanitary landfills in California, we were emitting massive amounts of fugitive methane, something to the tune of 41% of the leaked methane they found was coming out of these landfills. Now, most of the world doesn't even use landfills. They just have open pits that are sitting, breaking down into leachate, which is a toxic sludge that will go into groundwater, and everything on it that's rotting is breaking down into CO2 and methane and going right into the atmosphere.
Right.
So this notion that landfill even needs to exist should end from the human story. We have technologies now that can turn all of our waste into the building blocks of something else in perpetuity. Like, we are in the moment of molecular circularity, and that has to be an immediate closed loop that must be focused on, because it is a massive contributor to climate change. It is destroying our groundwater. It is resulting in our oceans being filled with plastic and microplastics, and all of that does not need to exist. So the technology is there to do it, so we can deploy trillions of dollars into it over the next decades and just end this from the human story.
Yeah, I agree with that. Most people don't understand that methane is 34 times more powerful in creating global warming than just CO2 itself. And that's a big problem. And I also talk about in the book, the melting tundras. When they start reducing, when they melt, they release methane. And that can cause a feedback loop that's irreversible.
Correct. Methane as a gas also freezes. It freezes in the
right.
And once it gets warmer, that frozen methane in the tundras starts to turn back into gas and just evaporate into our atmosphere.
Right. So, one thing that caught my eye actually was one of your investments in a company called InPipe, converting the kinetic energy of water to clean baseload power. I'm seeing, being surrounded by water and seeing the energy that's in our tidal currents and our wave energy. I'm not seeing a lot being done on that side of it, and I think that's a huge renewable energy source. What are your thoughts on that?
So I love this company. It's such an obvious piece of the climate equation that no one's thought of until these guys did. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we look for in FullCycle is we look for systemic solutions, not one-off solutions. And one of the biggest things that in the climate space is efficiency. How do we, instead of just building more renewable energy, how do we also make our buildings and our cities more efficient.
Correct.
Because it's much easier, cheaper, faster to make something more efficient than it is to go ahead and find land, get it permitted, buy solar panels, construct them. This is like decades of work just to be able to change the energy mix of the grid, and it's barely making up with new energy demand anyway. So we don't invest, for example, in technologies that make buildings more efficient, because that takes a one-by-one approach. We love those companies, we support those companies, but we don't invest in them because we don't view that as systemic. It's not getting the highest, let's say, climate return per dollar invested. So what is something that we can do in a city that increases efficiencies? And we dug in and we found that there's cities spend about 40 to 60% of their energy budget pushing around water, because municipalities have to obviously treat water and then push it out to the nether regions of their city or town. That takes a lot of energy to produce that much pressure. So what these cities and towns do is they put pressure reduction valves all over their cities and towns. So the areas that are close to the water treatment plant don't have so much pressure that you turn your shower on and it throws you across the bathroom.
Right.
And all of that energy that gets slowed down at these pressure reduction valves get wasted as heat. So this clever company just turned these pressure reduction valves into micro hydro turbines.
Wow.
Where they can capture that kinetic energy and turn it into baseload energy. We did the math, and at full deployment, it's a significant opportunity to offset global electricity consumption. There's around 395 potential in-pipe installation sites in the US alone, which is something like 140 gigawatts per year of energy.
Wow.
And it's if we did it on a global scale, it offsets about 9% of global electricity consumption with clean baseload alternatives. And it is kind of a low-hanging fruit that we don't talk about. And it doesn't require 68 million acres to produce the same amount of electricity from solar. It'll literally do it in 15,000 acres, which is half the size of Disney World.
And it really doesn't, what I'm hearing, it really doesn't cause any negative environmental impacts as a result of that.
No, there's no, there's,
Right.
there is no downside to this other
Right.
than time.
Right.
Time and the bureaucracy of cities and towns. Once more cities and towns realize that this is a very obvious solution to meet their net zero climate commitments, then it'll be just a matter of growing in pipe to be able to meet that demand. So we're in that inflection point at the moment.
Very cool. Regardless of where we fall on the climate debate, there are obvious financial benefits to investing in clean energy. What is the primary reason investors choose not to invest in environmentally friendly companies?
Gosh, I have to say that the only thing I can think of is legacy narratives that have since been debunked, but the investor hasn't upgraded their knowledge base. Because remember, in the past, it used to require some concessionary returns. Like, hey, I can make better money somewhere else, but I'm choosing to make less money here because it's the right thing to do. That's no longer true.
Right.
The CEO of BlackRock, the biggest asset manager in the world, said that the next, I don't even remember how many, I think the next 10,000 unicorns or something are all going to come from climate tech. And like I said earlier, John Doerr, one of the most prominent VC investors in history, said the first trillionaire is going to come from climate tech. Sometimes when you're a professional investor, you have access to trends and data that are very at the bleeding edge of understanding. And a lot of high net worth individuals who consider themselves investors are not keeping up with the latest data day by day, week by week. So it takes them sometimes decades to upgrade their understanding, and they're just regurgitating expired narratives. And I see that all the time. So I'm going to say the biggest thing is just inertia.
Mm-hmm. So at the end of the day, it really comes down to consumers. We can build these amazing clean energy projects, but if no one buys them, it doesn't work. How do we inform and enlighten them on the importance of it?
I actually don't think at the end of the day, it's up to the consumer. And if we actually think about it that way, I think we end up failing.
Okay.
The reason, because of what we discussed earlier, that bubble, that, wealth awareness bubble, because, you and I have access, we live in markets that can spend green premiums on any product or service because it aligns with our values. Now, our economy had to grow to that point such that we're in a position to have the freedom to make those choices. We have to have an economy that creates such a demand such that entrepreneurs will provide products and services, that come with a green premium, with a customer base that's willing to pay it. But that's not going to happen in places like Malaysia and Indonesia and India and the entire continent of Africa and all of the 450 million people who live in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, et cetera, and all of South America. So if we rely on consumer awareness to do the right thing, I think we perish trying to get there. I think what we do is we pick the technologies that make all of the means of production and all of the means of transportation, energy, you name it, all carbon neutral at the same or better costs than their legacy alternatives. Right. And then human beings go ahead and they do their human thing, whatever that is. The ones that care will do more of the right thing, and the ones that don't care or are unaware or are not in a position to dedicate the time and resources to learn to care, their footprint is completely neutralized because the food on their plate got there and was grown in a carbon neutral fashion. Their flights are offset with tree planting and forest planting around the world and are using renewable fuels. The world itself, you name it, I can mention it 1,001 ways, but every little piece of the equation, the toys that they gift their kids are made with completely recycled materials, and the recycling technology in itself is carbon neutral. So all of that makes for a carbon neutral civilization. And again, we become harmonious with the natural world, regardless of our understanding or our ideology. And that's why we need to approach it from the underpinnings of civilization instead of put the burden on consumers, because most consumers are not in a position to research and understand everything that you and I know. They're busy working 3 jobs, and 80% of them, it's the first time in their family history are they in a position to even be a consumer. So they want to celebrate that for decades to come. They are not going to, quote unquote, do what we know is the right thing. They're going to want to travel and eat steaks and go to Disney World and do all the things that, we take for granted. Do you agree?
Right. Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective. While you were talking, I was thinking of the developing countries and how the priorities are different than the developed countries, because, you're talking about subsistence living, where your priorities, certainly are different than people who are wealthy, for example, and do have these things that they will buy and, waste, and there's tremendous amount of waste, associated with that. So I can understand that. So on the flip side of that, what should consumers expect of businesses? What kind of sign can businesses show that they're truly tackling the climate crisis?
I think that's a great lever. Pressure from consumers on the Fortune 1000.
Right.
Because, these companies have a massive, massive global footprint, workforce, supply chain, energy mix. And if consumers really vote with their dollars and send a message to these companies, then those companies are kind of forced to start investing in accelerating the transition to a low carbon economy.
That's correct.
And one of the best trends that I've seen is the internal pressure at companies vis-a-vis employee morale, culture, retention, even expansion. Like, who wants to work for a company that does not invest in a low carbon future? How do these companies expect the next batch of graduates and MBAs to come and work for them if their reputation is being part of the problem instead of part of the solution? And we live in the information age, so even the past where they could whitewash and PR their actions into, pretending to do the right thing, consumers see through that now. Like, we live in a very transparent world. It's a big lever that consumers can have to put pressure on the Fortune 1000 to accelerate our transition to a low carbon future.
I agree with that 100%. Ibrahim, thank you very much for your perspective. I learned a lot myself, and I appreciate hearing it from the perspective of being an investor in clean tech. And thank you very much for being on our podcast, and I wish you well.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be on, and thank you for making these types of conversations available to millions of people so we also can accelerate our transition as a civilization to a more aware, more connected civilization that understands its own impact on itself and on the natural world. And that's only going to happen through proper dissemination of good information, and you're playing a key role in that, and I really appreciate it, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for all your good work, and let's hope that, all our work will make a difference.
Hear, hear.
And that wraps up another episode of Decarbonizing the World. I hope you enjoyed the show, and if you did, make sure you take a second to subscribe so you automatically get my new shows when they drop. Also, if you have a minute, I'd love if you left me a review so more folks like yourself can discover the show. Until next time, take care.
This has been Decarbonize the World with Frank Deline. To connect with Frank and to learn more about clean energy, reducing fossil fuels, and increasing profits, go to frankdeline.com. Decarbonize the World is a production of Advantage Audio.